Good. Well, thank you all for coming. Des has allowed me to introduce myself so I can be especially brief. I won't tell you my life story, but I would like to say that I've been knocking around ISMB for most of my adult life. In fact, I was one of the co-organizers for Larry of the first ISMB and of the second, and also of the ISCB. So it's a special thrill for me to be back to talk about what I've been doing in my dotage, which is to study the overlaps between computational biology and the humanities. In fact, digital humanities is one of the hottest topics in the arts at the moment, so I'm really trying to carve out a position for computational biology. And I really started this 15 years ago at ISMB San Diego when I gave the memorial talk for my longtime colleague Chris Overton, and that's where I first introduced the idea that Lewis Carroll invented sequence analysis, and since then I've been exploring such things as the relationship between John Keats and the English Romantic poets and systems biology, and also the work that I'll be talking about today on James Joyce. So I want to thank the organizers for the once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to talk about Joyce in Dublin. This just doesn't happen that often, and it's been wonderful to anticipate putting this together and putting this on for you. I want to especially thank Des, I think, for making this happen. And I'd also like to add thanks to Larry Hunter, who's been especially supportive of this work in particular. So to jump into it, this is the book in question. It says it first appeared in book form in 1922. This is a later printing, the 10th printing, but first appeared, as you see it there, in 1922. As with all his prior books, Joyce had a terrible time finding a publisher. And finally, it was taken on by an American expat named Sylvia Beach, who had a small bookstore in Paris called Shakespeare and Company. The 700 plus pages of the book were printed on very flimsy paper and loosely bound in a cardboard cover. And it wasn't until 10 years later that a German publisher issued a more manageable edition in 2 small paperback volumes. This is under the Odyssey Press imprint. And on the reverse, you can see a note at the bottom warning that the book is not to be introduced into the British Empire or the USA. And that's because in those English-speaking lands, Ulysses was a banned book. Large numbers of copies were seized by British custom agents, burned by the US Postal Service because the novel was deemed obscene. And so things stood until the American publisher Random House decided to fight the ban. And they arranged for a copy to be shipped to them and made sure it was seized. And then they challenged the seizure in court. And the resulting decision that you see here by U.S. District Court Judge John Woolsey essentially ruled that while the book was certainly filthy, he used the word emetic, it was nevertheless serious literature, and by virtue of that, not obscene. This ruling, incidentally, came on the day after the repeal of prohibition, so clearly America was ready to cut loose. Now, as noted, the Shakespeare and Company edition was published in 1922, although bits of Ulysses had been serialized in literary magazines previously, and they were harassed and hauled into court for their troubles. By the time of the Odyssey Press edition, many errata had been corrected, and there were many. You see an example here in this alignment. However, with each new edition, new errors were also introduced. And to make matters worse, because the book was banned in the US, it couldn't be copyrighted in the US, and that opened the door to a black market of pirated editions that were even more rife with errors. And when Judge Woolsey finally lifted the ban, Random House rushed to press with text that was copied from, of all things, a corrupted, pirated version that was masquerading as a Shakespeare and Company edition. Things were a little better on this side when the British relaxed their ban. An edition was brought out by the Bodley Head, and they prided themselves on their accuracy, which they continued to improve through a large number of printings. And Random House tried to redeem themselves by issuing a 1961 edition using the Bodley Head text, though in 2002 they became sentimental for the format of their pioneering 1934 edition. So they used that book design with the corrected text. Meanwhile, Joyce scholar Hans Gabler really opened a can of worms in 1984 with an edition that was based on the very earliest versions of the book, plus Joyce's notes, pre-publication. So the idea was to determine the author's original intentions. And it's of interest to us that Gabler made a lot of his use of computers to compare all of the available sources. And this set off a particularly nasty academic debate, and it came to be known as the Joyce Wars of the 1980s. Well, some scholars certainly were very enthusiastic about the use of computers. Others were skeptical that aligning scattered and often fragmentary texts was valid or even effective. And there are a lot more objections as well that centered on the use of early sources that had already been superseded by Joyce's own revisions and a lot of other issues. It's interesting to note parallels to the course of the human genome sequencing effort, where the Celera strategy depended upon a kind of a leap of faith, really, that effective algorithms could be developed for whole genome shotgun assembly, while the public effort was based on a more conservative divide and conquer approach. So this rivalry, many of you will recall, generated a lot of heat, and bioinformatics was in kind of an unfamiliar position of being in the center of the controversy. Well, in 1984, Gabler's tools were pretty primitive, and it occurred to me that this being Dublin, I ought to try my own multiple alignment using Clustal. Now, I didn't have access to those early versions, the earlier forms, in any digitized form, but Project Gutenberg, many of you know, hosts a large number of out-of-copyright books, including Ulysses, and they invite users to make corrections, and thankfully they archive all of their prior releases. So to simulate, in a way, the actual evolution of the book, I aligned the first chapter from each of these online versions. And by way of full disclosure, Des, I did fiddle with the output a bit for the sake of readability and because Clustal doesn't do spaces or punctuation, but it wouldn't take much tweaking. In any case, the versions were nearly identical, just some minor formatting differences you can see in the uppercase first line of one release. But there was one interesting difference. Down in the lower left there, where one version substitutes the word by for the word on in the second sentence of the book. And every print edition that I could get my hands on, which included a facsimile of the 1922 edition, every one of those versions has the word by in that position, with the sole exception of the Gabler edition, which, like the most recent Gutenberg text, has the word on there. So this strongly suggests the evolutionary origin of the Gutenberg edition, even though it's not documented as such on their site. Now, there's a broader name for the sort of textual analysis done by Gabler and his critics. It's called genetic criticism, appropriately enough, another hot topic in the humanities. Genetic criticism sees a literary text not as a single static object, but as a dynamic collection of versions and sources, and they derive from each other over time. And even when the earliest versions are unknown or uncertain, there's a long-established discipline called stemmatics in the humanities that tries to do reconstructions with what we would recognize as cladistic methods. And the best example of that was something done to Chaucer's Canterbury Tales by a group that actually included molecular phylogeneticists from Cambridge, who used Popp and Splitstree on many versions of the Wife of Bath's prologue. And these had been copied successively by monks, who each introduced errors and other sorts of variations, and then copies of copies of copies, and so forth. Incidentally, Irish monks in the early Middle Ages were especially productive in copying and preservation of early text, ancient texts, in addition to illuminated manuscripts like the Book of Kells that you may have seen in your travels. So this is the famous Random House first edition of 1934. This is in its fifth printing of that same year. And if we open to the preface, we see that it includes the complete text of Judge Woolsey's decision, which is something that Random House did continue to do for decades in successive editions. And moving on to the actual text of the novel, notice the iconic modernist design by Ernst Reichel, who enlarged the first letter of each chapter. It's what printers call a drop cap, to fill an entire page. So everything about Ulysses, it seems, was oversized. In 1961, Random House issued a paperback version under its Viking imprint, and this is the very copy that I dutifully bought at the campus bookstore 45 years ago for a notorious literature course that I was taking. And I started reading the book then, but like most people, I just didn't get very far. And I didn't actually finish the book, again, full disclosure, until about 5 years ago. In fact, I was here in Dublin at the time I finished it. Now, by that time, I was reading it electronically, but when I went back and opened my undergraduate text out of curiosity, out fell this page from my class notes at the time. And my instructor, you can see, had helpfully listed the chapters and page numbers because, in fact, Joyce didn't include chapter headings, so the text just flowed together in the original version. And we can see on the right that the book is divided into 3 sections, which is in parallel with the Homeric epic, the Odyssey, on which it's based. And there are also themes attached to each chapter, or I should say episode. And I assumed at the time that these were my instructor's brilliant insights, but I found out much later that he simply cribbed them from this standard schema of the book, which is actually similar to the one Joyce himself followed as he was writing, and later shared with several critics and friends, including this one published by Stuart Gilbert. You can see each episode is done in a distinctive style. There are overarching themes and symbolism that he attached to each episode, and various literary styles that he used. The episodes each correspond to about an hour in a single day. In fact, a specific day, which is the 16th of June, 1904, and that's now known as Bloom's Day. The overwhelming impression as you look at something like this is of how systematic he was, even I'd say scientific, in his writing process, which stands in stark contrast to how chaotic it can seem to the novice reader. So you have to have faith that there was a system behind it. Now, another thing that the writing of Ulysses had in common with the Human Genome Project is that it wasn't over when it was over. Not only were there a significant continuing effort at curation of the text by many scholars and archivists, but when Ulysses was finally released, hardly anyone understood it. It required a lot of research, a lot of annotation of the text to begin to make it intelligible to what you might call the lay reader at a detailed level. However much people might enjoy the overall effect of the prose, readers' guides began to appear almost immediately and continue to be published on a regular basis down to the present day. And some have literally line-by-line notes to get you through the text, as well as a lot of general criticism and voluminous scholarship that is continuing to uncover new layers of meaning, much as Joyce himself intended, as you can see from that quote at the end there. Well, turning to the text, the novel starts off innocently enough. There's a celebrated scene on the Martello Tower just a few miles down the coast from here. The writing is fairly conventional. It parses easily. You can see here the view from the actual tower, which Joyce lived in for a time, and that's my wife, Nora, in the foreground. Now, some of you may know that Nora was also the name of Joyce's wife. She was working as a chambermaid when they first went out on the same day the novel takes place. And they were ill-matched in terms of education and temperament, but they had a successful relationship, somewhat tempestuous, but they lasted. Now, I hasten to add that my own Nora is extremely well-educated. PhD in English from Princeton. She's been such a great help in putting this talk together that I'd like to acknowledge her for that, and also for many of the photos that I'm going to be showing you. Now, as noted, the book changes perspective and style with each episode. Here's third episode. We have an interior monologue, in this case by Stephen Dedalus. He's the tortured and rather dissipated young intellectual who's the hero of the first part of the novel, and he clearly represents Joyce himself. These are his thoughts as he walks along Sandymount Strand towards Dublin, and they're full of abstract philosophical musings, literary allusions, foreign language fragments. In other words, you can see this is the point in the book where most readers give up in despair. Speaking of which, it's hard to put up a talk about literature without showing a lot of text, but please don't feel you need to read it all. Just consider these teasers. You should read the book. Now, as an aside, when Craig Venter's Institute made their artificial mycoplasma genome a few years ago, they added identifying watermarks to the sequence that included a series of quotes encoded in arbitrary triplets. And among those quotes, the only non-scientist that they quoted was Joyce from A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, which is a prequel. It's about Stephen's life before the events in Ulysses. And the quote here is from a passage where Stephen is drawing inspiration from the sight of a graceful young woman on Dollymount Strand, which is just the other side of the mouth of the Liffey from where the Proteus episode takes place that I just showed you. Now, soon the main character of the novel is introduced. That's Leopold Bloom. Most of the book follows his wanderings around Dublin. And here he's visiting Sweeney's Pharmacy behind Trinity College Park near Marion Square, a shop that, by the way, is maintained today just as it was in Joyce's description of it, so definitely worth a visit. Note on the text that compared to Stephen, Bloom's interior monologue is much less about abstract ideas, more about sensory experience. It's as if Joyce is setting off the rational from the empirical. Just as an example, Bloom uses words related to taste, touch, and smell more than 5 times as frequently as Stephen, by my count. Bloom is a journeyman advertising salesman. He's a bit of a schlub. He's slogging his way through life in the face of slates to his Jewish heritage, his wife's infidelity, memories of a son who died in infancy and a father who committed suicide. Many, many challenges for poor Leopold Bloom, but he stays positive, he stays empathetic, he's continually curious about the world. So he's not the hero of Greek legend by a long shot, but he's certainly a hero of a different sort and a very sympathetic character. Now, the wife in question is Molly Bloom, and here I skip ahead to the very last episode of the novel, and this is where we finally encounter Molly in spectacular fashion. This is the most free form of the interior monologues. We've had Stephen, we've had Bloom, now Molly's soliloquy, as it's called, is essentially just a continuous stream of words with very little structure otherwise. This is what it looks like. As I've said, compared to those of Stephen and Bloom, this is obviously Joyce's most audacious attempt to simulate the undirected, unanchored course of pure thought. It's really an experiment in cognitive science, and following, by the way, on the recent theories of William James, who introduced the idea just a few decades before. So the result is this loosely connected sequence of short, fragmented phrases with a lot of interspersed ands and yeses in the denouement that I'm showing you here. The photo is Finn's Hotel, and that's where Nora worked as a chambermaid when she arrived in Dublin from Galway. And she, of course, was in many ways the model for Molly, who has even less schooling than Bloom, let alone Stephen. Now, for anyone interested in text mining and NLP, natural language processing, this would seem at first glance to be your worst nightmare. Working backward from the end of the novel, this is the longest string of words that the Charniak probabilistic parser would accept without choking. And it goes on and on. Given the frequent incidence of ands, it simply strings clauses together in one big conjunction, and it doesn't quite know what to do with the yeses, which are even more frequent. It treats them as interjections or adverbs. Well, what this does is really demonstrate the futility of trying to parse text like this. And in fact, the field of NLP has recognized the advantage of what's called shallow parsing or chunking, and this entails doing part of speech tagging and building up bottom-up short phrasal constituents, which are essentially limited to regular expression grammars. There's no attempt to create a full syntactic resolution of a sentence tree. So I built a rudimentary chunker using the NLTK toolkit from UPenn, in which I simply created a new ad hoc part of speech for the problematic yeses, and excluded them and the ands from the chunks. I also threw in a catch-all clause category, which captures a little more structure, but still without recursion. And this leaves nice bite-sized chunks of simple phrases that one might even think of as units of discrete thought amid the overall stream. Chunking was invented. It was originally thought to better reflect how humans read, but Joyce might have felt it reflects how humans think. Perhaps even anticipating modern discontinuous models of consciousness, such as those of Susan Blackmore and Daniel Dennett. As a trick, you may have seen where language is randomly generated based on bigram or trigram frequencies in a given text, and this can sometimes yield short stretches that sound weirdly like a certain author's style, but without making any sense. That is, the probability of the next word is a function only of the preceding word or two. It's a Markov chain of low order. And given Molly's quick changes of direction, lack of long-range structure, she basically just follows on from one thought to the other without ever popping the stack, as it were. It occurred to me that this might be just the right model for Molly's soliloquy, for her stream of consciousness. So I rigged up a second-order Markov model that can generate Molly for just as long as you like. And if you stare at these for a while, you'll likely decide correctly that the real Molly is on the left and the generated Molly is on the right. But I think you'll admit it's a lot less obvious than with many other sources, if you should try this trick yourself. Well, returning back to the earlier part of the novel, the next episode depicts a funeral that Bloom attends, and I include a bit of the text here for the sole purpose of bringing us back to earth and calming you down. There's reassuring you that the book is not all free-floating interior monologue. There is a coherent narrative to sort of anchor the action, but there are many experiments yet to come. The next episode, Eolus it's called, takes place in the offices of a newspaper where Bloom sells advertising. And there's a lot of coming and going of characters that include both Bloom and Stephen, though they don't overlap. At one point, several of the characters pop out to the Oval Pub, which you see here, so on Middle Abbey Street, just off O'Connell. The distinctive thing about this episode is the presence of interspersed headings in the style of newspaper headlines at the time. And what Joyce is doing, in effect, is demonstrating what's called topical segmentation in NLP. And one thing we notice about the headlines, as well as the text in Eolus, is that they often contain rhetorical devices, such as the metaphor of Ireland as a green gem. Another piece, another example of a rhetorical device here is irony. There's a bit of purple prose which is described as a recently discovered fragment of Cicero's, which obviously intended to be ironic. And experts looking at this can see many more examples of rhetorical devices, otherwise known as figures of speech or tropes. Most of these I'm showing you have been annotated by critics, and while some are familiar to you, I'm sure many are quite obscure, as they are to me. All of these were cataloged first by ancient Greek and Roman rhetoricians, starting with Aristotle, but then notably Cicero and Quintilian, had all of these worked out back in those times. Here's another device known as metonymy. This applies when a word is not used literally, but instead to refer to something with which it's closely associated. So there's actually two metonyms in this headline. We see the crozier, which is a bishop's crooked staff, is meant to denote the institution of the church, while the pen denotes the institution of journalism. And here again, there are many examples. In fact, Joyce was deliberately piling them on. He was using a huge range of rhetorical devices because that was the subject in his little chart of this particular chapter. It was this particular aspect of language that he's exploring. So he kept adding new ones in successive revisions. This is how we know that he was laying it on. He accumulated at least 113 different types that one critic has counted, and often used several times. So more interesting rhetorical devices add important nuance to language, like metaphor. That makes them quite a challenge for NLP. In fact, the handling of irony is a long-standing research topic in NLP and AI. Now, as scientists, we make extensive use of rhetoric in its most traditional sense, which is to argue and persuade. Scientific papers use rhetorical devices in patterns that we fall into without even thinking about it. There's a significant body of scholarly literature on the rhetoric of science, showing things like how rhetorical choices affect a paper's impact. And biology specifically depends heavily on metaphor to express its ideas. If you stop and think about some of our phraseology. We also use metonymy, sometimes sloppily, when we speak of genes in lieu of phenotypes or products with which they're associated. So this is not a surprise to, or would not have been a surprise to the linguist Roman Jakobson, who had a theory. He believed that metaphor and metonymy were two fundamental modes of expression in language, and they formed a polarity that was useful in categorizing everything from aphasias to literary genres. And they also, I believe, capture many of the fundamental methods we use in bioinformatics. So, for example, we infer homology from similarity. That's a metaphor. We often reason by analogy. We also infer function on the basis of contiguity or co-occurrence, what we sometimes call guilt by association. When we don't know a lot about a gene, it may be named metaphorically according to what it's like, or maybe metonymically by something with which it associates. And there's still a sizable fraction of Hugo genes that have such names attached to them. In some cases, they're alternatives or prior names, but mostly they're current approved names. So genes are named metaphorically and metonymically. So moving on, in Ulysses, it's now lunchtime, and Bloom is covering a lot of ground, as we will also. Here he pauses in front of Trinity College, and there's a lot of description of food and eating. That's the theme that Joyce identified for this episode. And here we see Davy Byrne's Pub on Duke Street, just a few blocks south of Trinity, and this is where Bloom stops for a glass of Burgundy and a Gorgonzola sandwich, which many literary tourists also do in imitation. Next episode returns to Stephen. He's debating some older literary types at the National Library on Kildare Street, pictured here. Stephen is expounding on Aristotle and making the case for his elaborate pet theory about Hamlet, which is referred to throughout the book. And the next episode I'll spend some time on. This is called Wandering Rocks. It takes a break from following Stephen and Bloom about midway through the book, and it describes the activities of many citizens of Dublin, many characters in the book, all across Dublin over the course of a single hour. So here's Dublin as we experience it today, and here's the Dublin that Joyce knew, pretty similar, from a map of that period. I ask you to watch carefully because I'm going to show you the locations over time of the many characters in this episode, sped up about 500-fold. So the first path you saw in blue was that of a priest named Father Conmee, who's traveling on foot and by tram from his church to an orphanage in the suburbs. And that last path in red was the rapidly moving carriage of the Lord Lieutenant of Ireland, the Earl of Dudley, who was the representative of the Crown in Ireland, the British Crown, of course. So he's on his way to a public event across town with his entourage. The other characters are mostly on foot. Many more are stationary or going about their business, interacting with each other in a variety of ways. Now, as a permanent exile from his homeland, Joyce relied not only on his memory, but also on maps and a street directory for the details of various characters' wanderings through the city. He mentions many businesses, notably pubs, as well as streets, individual houses, many other landmarks. And what he's doing is he's pulling entities off of maps and out of directories to insert in his text, essentially reversing the process of what is today called named entity recognition. It's a very important technology for NLP and bioinformatics in particular. Now, a friend described Joyce's process in writing this episode, and we can see just as in his schemas, he's being very systematic, even scientific, as he approaches this task. The map with the paths that I showed you is not unlike what he had in front of him, what he drew on as he was writing. So to reverse engineer this process would be a particularly interesting GIS exercise. That is Geographic Information Systems, which are increasingly using AI. So the sheer number of interactions in this episode practically begs for a social network analysis. So I wrangled the content of Wandering Rocks into a Prolog database of interpersonal interactions of various types, added a little bit of logic, and ported it into Gephi for visualization. And you can see the network looks scale-free. It's got an average degree of 3.5 and an average path length of 3.3, so it is a fairly small world. But it's a little bit deceptive because most of the interactions are due to the vice-regal cavalcade that you see as the big green star just below the center. And these don't really count because they're mostly just passing sightings, not really substantive interactions. Bloom, however, is just north of center. And even though he has a very minor role in this chapter, he's actually alone. He's shopping for a racy novel at a bookseller stand. Despite being such a minor character, he still ranks second overall in node degree. That's basically because everybody's talking about him. And he's fifth in betweenness centrality. So that suggests that he's a very social creature, which is something we already knew, of course. So he would clearly be the major hub if the network were expanded to the entire novel. And Stephen would come in probably a close second. In fact, critics have emphasized the exceptional interconnectedness of Ulysses, not just in terms of interactions, but in the complex interweaving of styles and mythic parallels and symbols, metaphors, literary allusions, cultural references, on and on. So it might truly be called a systems novel. Well, the episode has an interesting structure composed of 19 separate segments or subsegments, beginning with Father Conmee's walk, you recall, and ending with the vice-regal cavalcade. So it's helpful to arrange these in a circle because we're also going to find that there are periodic short insertions of events that are parts of other segments. For example, in segment 19, there's a description of two women watching the vice-regal cavalcade go by, and these same women are described in a short insertion in segment 15. So we could just call this a flash forward, but if you read it carefully, as critics obviously have, it turns out it's a clue that segments 15 and 19 actually overlap each other in real time. In fact, there's a fair number of these simultaneous or nearly simultaneous events seemingly pinning the segments together. Essentially, the text is laced with short repeats that are in effect mobile elements. And of course, we know how to deal with that sort of thing. Now, these short repeats actually are not usually not exact. In fact, there can be internal structure to them. So here we see that there's a simple direct repeat of Miss Kennedy's head by Miss Deuce's head, but there's also an inverted repeat whereby bronze by gold becomes gold by bronze, as well as a translocation of an adverbial phrase from the end of the sentence to the beginning. By the way, these sorts of rearrangements, when they're applied to language, correspond to rhetorical devices, not surprisingly so. An example is an inverted repeat is called an anti-metaboly. All of this terminology already existed long before we started dealing with sequence. Well, not only is time jumbled, but the segments are also scattered all over Dublin. I used latitudes and longitudes from Google Maps, added the locations to my Prolog database, and I wrote an SVG driver to produce this visualization. And if you think about it, it corresponds to the paths on the map that I showed several slides back, but it captures the bird's eye view of Dublin that critics often call this episode. Now, we'd like to relate the text to time just as we've related it to space here. And that requires lining up the repeated elements that I showed you and taking advantage of a lot of other textual clues. And fortunately, critics have pored over this and produced a rough consensus, which I'm showing here, as to how the segments map to real time on the top there. Now, there are some intriguing patterns here, but in the final analysis, I think I have to admit that it's all about as helpful as most other hairballs. A much more useful visualization, though, is as a contig assembly. So here we have continuous time sheared into short overlapping segments in order here from top to bottom. And you can see how they're anchored above and below by Father Conmee on the one hand and the Viceregal Cavalcade segment on the other. And one critic has actually suggested that this shows how Dubliners were constrained between church and state, or metonymically between crozier and crown, if you prefer. The other thing I've done here is to show the rate at which the narrative moves by making the area of the segments reflect the amount of text. So for instance, the Viceregal Cavalcade takes a lot of time, but not much text. So it's long and skinny, while some of the more densely descriptive segments are fatter. So with this sort of visualization, I think you can really begin to get an idea of the structure that would otherwise be pretty obscure. So moving on, a few episodes later, the narrative switches to an unidentified third person who's relating a pub conversation with occasional earthy commentary. And it has stalled for some reason. Well, I'm missing half. I hope that doesn't propagate. What Joyce is going to do, though, is he's going to take this ordinary conversational narrative, which was very colloquial in tone, and then he's going to introduce a series of interludes that are very different. And you're not seeing it, unfortunately. So let's cross our fingers that doesn't keep up. What he does, I'll have to describe it, is he introduces interludes that are very different in their linguistic character. So we had a bar conversation, as I say, very colloquial, and in the middle of that, it's suddenly interrupted by, in this case, it was a paragraph written in the style of pseudoscientific spiritualist literature that was very popular at the time. So it's very high-flown language, very dense, obviously quite different from the bar conversation. But the theme is consistent with the context, and after this segment, the colloquial narrative resumes just as suddenly as it was interrupted. So it becomes clear that Joyce is experimenting with what the linguist Zelig Harris, who was Chomsky's teacher, called sublanguages. These are subsets of language that are specialized to a particular social or professional group, not just in their vocabulary, but also in their whole range of aspects of linguistic properties that make them a very different tone of language. Here's an example of medical sublanguage in Cyclops, albeit fairly dated medical language. Here's another example, this time of legal language. And you can see what Joyce is doing here with this midstream alternation between varieties of language is an exaggerated version of a very well-studied phenomenon that linguists call code switching. Still more examples, parliamentary language, and even Irish legend. And again, it's always in the service of the general narrative. So these blocks of distinctive, highly stylized text, each of which has a different character, are themselves often split up into subsegments. So they'll also be interrupted and distributed across the background conversation of the pub. So it's getting pretty complicated. What we need here is some kind of a tool to get to grips with this episode. And so with apologies to the folks at UCSC and EBI, I prototyped this literature browser in WX Python. You see across the center of the display there the the various sublanguage segments. Some of them have been interrupted multiple times. The top 7 tracks of hash marks show various elements and characteristics of the text, such as sentences and paragraphs, questions, exclamations, proper nouns, dialogue, descriptions, the latter as indicated by adjectives and adverbs. So you get a feeling for the text. The 3 graphs at the bottom show moving averages representing the use of uncommon vocabulary, word lengths, and syllables per word. So zooming in a bit, I can get a better idea of the properties of the rich segments. It's apparent that they tend to have longer sentences and paragraphs, no dialogue. They're often more descriptive. They also clearly have a more sophisticated vocabulary and longer words. In fact, we can see a sharp peak in word length. If I can get this to work. No. Sharp peak of word length. If you look at about line 750 at the bottom there, you see where it peaks, and we can select that. And then you see in the text window at the bottom that Joyce has humorously concocted an absurdly long German compound word. It's an academic title, so that caused a little bit of deviation there in the word length. You can also see other features. You can see a heavy density of names in the region around 240. Let me see if I can point that out, where this sort of shades to cyan. Very heavy density of proper names. So if we click on that, we indeed see a list of seemingly unrelated names in the window at the bottom. We can actually pop up a window on the text at that point. And we see that the list goes on and on and on. It's a collection of supposed Irish heroes and heroines of antiquity, which includes the likes of Charlemagne, Captain Moonlight, the Last of the Mohicans, and Brian Confucius. So this is a good time to mention something I haven't emphasized, which is the element of humor in Ulysses. It's very rich. It ranges from ribald to sardonic to Pythonesque. It's one of the main draws for the people who love this novel. The next episode begins in the style of cheap magazine romance that was especially popular at the time. This is unfolding in the mind of a girl sitting on Sandymount Strand. It's yet one more of the many voices that Joyce assumes in Ulysses. We saw him experimenting with time and space in Wandering Rocks, while he's constantly experimenting with literary style as well. And this is nowhere more apparent than in the next episode, a very famous episode, which takes place at a maternity hospital. The theme is procreation, and the form is a succession of paragraphs that correspond to the weeks of embryonic development from conception to birth, 1 week per paragraph. At the same time, it recapitulates the history of the English language. So just to make that concrete, after some preliminaries that hark back to Latin, he starts with an imitation of Old English. As you see here, it's transliterated, or you wouldn't be able to read it. But later paragraphs are written in the style of major authors of their time, such as Mallory, Milton. And in each case, he's seeing to it that the content is in context and it advances the narrative. So these are not interruptions, they're part of the flow, just as in the Cyclops episode. Skipping forward a bit, we see stylistic signatures of Bunyan, Pepys in diary form, Defoe. Much later, we see Landor, Huxley, Dickens, and on and on. So he's doing 2 things in parallel here in this interesting fashion. And notice that when he portrays the evolution of the English language in this way, he has in mind not only ontogeny, that is development, but also species, phylogeny, as we learn in this quote from this letter that he wrote. In fact, the analogy between language evolution and biological evolution is one that Darwin himself asserted. And Darwin is mentioned by name in this episode. And in fact, the paragraph I just showed you mimicking Thomas Huxley alludes to survival of the fittest. And you may know that Huxley was a great defender of evolutionary theory, who was known as Darwin's bulldog. Finally, at the moment of birth, there's this exuberant passage in the style of Carlyle. And pictured here is the maternity hospital on Hollis Street, which is where the episode takes place. And it's still functioning as such today. Now, there's certainly, as you might guess, been a lot of refined literary scholarship about this chapter. This has really got the attention of the English lit crowd. But we now have the ability to use a computational blunt instrument to address the question, how well did Joyce do in his literary caricatures? So I did what's called a stylometric analysis by training classifiers for a range of authors that I got out of the Project Gutenberg texts. And I used a straightforward nearest neighbor algorithm from the JGAP toolset, measuring both Joyce's choice of vocabulary on the left and syntactic patterns on the right. And these heat maps show the results for the authors progressing in time from top to bottom, as you see, and Joyce's text progressing by paragraph, which is to say by time, from left to right across the bottom. So the blocks of red at the upper left of each heat map show you that the earliest authors are the most recognizable, probably not surprising, both in terms of lexicon and syntax, and the rest is very noisy, though perhaps you can make out a general trend on the descending diagonals. As noisy as this is, if I combine these metrics and do a traditional head-to-head comparison of classifiers against paragraphs that critics have identified with specific authors, that is, they've used their own judgment as to what author is being portrayed, end up with some creditable results. We see that the classifiers for Chaucer, Mallory, Bunyan are doing especially well, again, as expected. Also, a fair number of others do well in terms of rank. Several had decent recall, but not much precision, and a few weren't good at all. I haven't done a positive control testing the classifiers on independent test sets, so I don't know if it's the classifiers that are bad or Joyce's imitations, but what we do know is that Joyce really nailed a fair number of them in terms of imitating style as detected by the computer and by critics. Now, in the Ithaca chapter, Bloom finally arrives at his home with Stephen in tow, and Joyce now advances the exposition by posing and answering questions. This is in the style of a Roman Catholic catechism, and so the immediate response from critics was that this is what Joyce was imitating. But if you read them as a computer scientist, I think you see that the answers seem very precise, very detailed, very formal, and even fussy. And I get the uncanny feeling that they're sort of answers a computer might provide. And question answering is certainly an important goal for NLP systems. So Joyce is again demonstrating something that we try to do today computationally. But as I say, these answers that are given often have this sense of too much information. And it's as if Joyce is actually lampooning the Gricean maxim, the maxim of quantity, which is one of the axioms of cooperation that in modern discourse analysis is taken as an assumption. And at the other extreme, from pragmatics of linguistic processing, is syntactic analysis, and Joyce even addresses that. He's got an extensive answer where he does a really detailed syntactic analysis, choking with linguistic terminology, really. Some of the over-informative answers try to explain events by going back to physical first principles. And this is the way an AI system might attempt to do causal reasoning by recourse to naive physics. So here a boiling teapot is over-explained to the point of calculating the thermodynamics of the heat transfer. In addition, there are several places where various forms of temporal reasoning and calculation are carried to absurd lengths. Again, the sense of TMI, which kind of reminds me of a science fiction cliche of the pedantic and overly helpful computer or robot or android. There's also a strong AI flavor to the Q&As that give detailed descriptions of scenes. They're full of precise quantitative, geometric, and geographic elements, and you can't help but feel that this is what an intelligent computer vision system might tell us. And we even see a Q&A that recapitulates in a few lines Bloom's entire day's activities. So basically the whole novel condensed into one short paragraph. So this is suggestive of NLP tasks of summarization and gisting. And really the overall impression is that the linguistic games that Joyce is playing in Ithaca and actually throughout the novel are a catalog of NLP and AI goals, challenges, methods. Well, Francis Collins did more than anyone, I suppose, to popularize the notion of the genome as the book of life, and I'd like to suggest that Ulysses is another kind of book of life. Others have already done so. I've focused here today on fairly technical aspects of the text as they may relate to concerns of bioinformatics and text mining. But in closing, I need to emphasize that Ulysses was immediately recognized as having captured something profound about the human condition. One can read it as a series of puzzles, and puzzles are great fun, but it's also a phenomenal piece of literature, and first and foremost, you should read it as a book of life. Well, thank you very much for your attention. Of course.
I should know this. How long did it take him to write that?
Well, it's been versioned over time. I mean, I started with an early version actually for the text mining SIG at ISMB 5 years ago. So that was the first sort of tentative trial, but I've been adding to it ever since.
So how long, Joyce, how long did it take him to write that?
Oh, Joyce. Oh, much less time than me. No. He started in 1914 and finished essentially in 1921.
Okay.
Yeah. So are the methods you used available for other people to try them out? So if I wanted to write in the style of various authors, could I use your method of?
For the stylometric analysis, I used a public domain tool called JGAP, which is used in the digital humanities community. So JGAAP, you can find it on the web.
Thank you.
So I have a question. Hi.
Yeah.
So, beautiful piece of work and really, really interesting.
Thanks.
If you had to consider doing something similar with computational tools on the language of music, would you care to make any comments in terms of what you think would be important points, and maybe what your Joycean text that you would start with would be?
Well, a few things. First of all, Joyce was very interested in music, and one of the episodes that I didn't cover is all about music. It's an episode that takes place in a hotel where there's a lot of singing, and it's Joyce called it a fuga per canone, which is a fugue by rule, and so he tried to develop the chapter based on the rules of the fugue. And so Joyce was certainly interested in music. Occasionally, you will even find fragments of musical notation in the novel as well. So, so that might tempt me to address that question. If I was more of a musician, I might be able to answer the question from a technical standpoint. But certainly, if Joyce was interested in the musical possibilities, there must be ways to approach that. And obviously, there are also other people who work on what you might call informatic aspects of music.
Thanks for that. Sorry. Very nice talk. I'm a little bit afraid of the potential of overfitting in your methods. Did you put them to a cross-validation approach? Or?
Yes. No. This has not been peer reviewed, and and I'm not sure how it would stand up. Yes. I've certainly presented the most interesting aspects that I could pull out, and I'll give you an example, perhaps, that gets to your point. The generator of Mali soliloquy. I generated a great number of segments of that length, and so I did cherry pick the one that I showed you. However, I will say that I didn't cherry pick so much on the basis of what looked good as what was least scandalous. This being a family meeting, actually 9 out of 10 I could not have put up. So, But yes, to your point, yeah, this would need some work if I was going to turn it into a truly scholarly effort. But this is, call it a proof of concept or call it entertainment.
So, quite apparently, your talk was designed to support and enlarge and give Ulysses the right stage. But you could also try to criticize it and to find flaws in it, or is it a perfect book? I don't know. One concrete possibility that came to my mind is in that time circle.
Mm-hmm.
You want to look whether it's an interval graph, and if not, there's sometimes some logic errors in the use of time or maybe use of space. So did you think about this sort of thing? You know, with Hollywood movies, it's very
Yeah.
people like to find errors.
Yeah, yeah. Is there a blooper reel for Ulysses? I think. Well, let me confess something that may be a partial answer to what you're asking. When I first put that prologue database together, my goal was not to use the critics' analysis of the mapping to space and time, but to actually do it myself by machine learning. And so I tried very hard with basic hill climbing approaches to do that alignment. And the problem is it would very quickly converge on a very nice alignment, which is nothing like what the critics had decided. And going back, it was clear the critics were right and I was wrong. And the problem is I could not come up with an objective function, which, put it another way, I think the information Joyce has provided is underspecified. There's not enough information there to do it from first principles. And so the critics are not confined to the simple points in time that I use. They can make inferences about what's this character like and what are they likely to have done in this period, and that sort of thing, which I couldn't do. So yeah, my machine learning effort failed in that case.
Thank you. So about the styles that don't match actually with what the critics think he meant, which author,
Yeah.
could the critics be wrong, and could he have meant to imitate a different author? Would there
Yes.
be ways to find this out?
Yes, absolutely. They could be wrong. Some of them are fairly obvious. You don't mistake Pepys' diary, but there has been recent scholarship in genetic studies. Genetic Joyce Studies is actually the name of the online journal, where it's been suggested that it's actually much more of a mixture than critics are letting on. So critics are sort of picking a consensus view of a particular paragraph, but there are certainly mixtures of elements. So that could account for some of my salt and pepper noise. The other approach critics have taken is to go back and look at Joyce's actual library that he had accessible to him at that time. And one example, my analysis did very poorly on Pepys's diary. And it turns out that Joyce's edition of Pepys's diary was an edited version, which was very, very dissimilar to the original text of Pepys, which I would have found in Project Gutenberg. And so Joyce was actually imitating the wrong Pepys, really. He was imitating something that somebody had just done a very bad job of editing, and not minor changes, really chopping up the style in a very lamentable way. So yes, there's all kinds of caveats about using the critics' assignments there.
So on the topic of imitation of style, can you perhaps cluster PubMed articles by styles and design the evolutionary tree?
What kind of articles?
PubMed.
PubMed art by style. Well, you could you could certainly do a stylistic analysis. I think it might be cruel. But yeah, I briefly referred to the Rhetoric of Science, and there's been a lot written, not by scientists, but by sociologists about who are interested in things like the social construction of science, about how scientists use rhetoric and how it can actually hamper certain papers. And example in one paper that I saw was a comparison of Watson and Crick's 1953 paper with Avery's 1944 paper. You could argue that Avery's discovery that DNA was the genetic material was as important as the discovery of the structure, or the postulation of the structure of DNA by Watson and Crick, but it had just, you know, minuscule impact compared to Watson and Crick. And what this author had done was to actually do a rhetorical comparison of the rhetorical devices that they'd used. And Watson and Crick were just much more assertive. They were much more audacious in their language. And Avery was very low-key and modest and wordy, and he just made the wrong rhetorical choices, according to this particular author. Otherwise, he may have had more of a splash. Sorry, evolution of style?
Evolution of style. Can you find a common ancestor to all the styles that we have in science?
Well, I think it's certainly true that style has evolved. I remember when I was starting out, papers read much more like detective stories, and now they read much, well, I don't want to say what they read like now, but so yeah, I would imagine you could find style changes.
Okay, so we'll allow one more question.
Would it be interesting to reproduce the whole study also on all translations of James Joyce in German and French? And
Yeah, play a little game of telephone, perhaps. Yeah, I mean, obviously it has been translated into all those languages, and I haven't looked at that in the case of Joyce. I've looked at it in the case of Lewis Carroll, but yeah, I think that would be an interesting thing to look at as well.